everybody, and welcome to the final instalment of this year's Mystery Blanket Club. I am so excited that finally we've reached month number 10 after working so hard this year from March to December on this project. But today it's time for the final reveal, the reveal of the title, and also I'm going to dedicate today's blog to talk to you all about the design and how it came about, all the inspiration for it, my design process, and hopefully this will help you understand what you've been knitting for the past 10 months. So here we go. The title of the 2022 Mystery Blanket is Deco Dreams. Now, I think many of you may well have guessed the title. It was quite a short title, and within that title 2 of the letters were repeated, so it didn't give me much scope for giving you many letters in the puzzle that we had going on in the blog. And many of you have written in to let us know that you have guessed the title correctly. But if there's anybody out there who was still guessing, now you know what it is, and I'm about to tell you all about how the design came about and all the inspiration for all those squares in the blanket. The Art Deco style began in the 1910s in France, but it reached its peak in the 1920s and 30s. And being 2022 this year, I thought, what better time than to use Art Deco as the inspiration for my mystery blanket design 100 years on from when it first all started. I absolutely love everything about the Art Deco style. It's glamorous, it's sophisticated, it's elegant, and it's extremely sparkly. And you know how much I love sparkle. So this was the perfect, for me, the perfect source of inspiration. It meant I could use lots of sparkly beads. There is lots of geometric patterning as well, which translates just perfectly into knitting. I was incredibly excited about using Art Deco for my blanket design. Now, if any of you have knitted my mystery cushions, you may have knitted my Metropolis cushion in 2017. This was also inspired by Art Deco, but it used a very different colour palette. It was still very sparkly. I used Rowan 4-ply cotton, so a fine yarn, a mixture of our larger and our smaller beads in a sort of more of a sombre colour palette, sort of aubergine, silvers and jade green colours. But it had lots of strong geometric patterns, loads and loads of beads, beaded tassels at the top, lots of sort of geometric patterning. So that was my first sort of Art Deco inspired design. But to work on a blanket was great, giving me 49 squares to indulge myself in all this wonderful pattern work. What fascinates me today is how the influence of the Art Deco style can still be seen around it in so many different places today. And I was hugely inspired when I started researching the Art Deco style. I was hugely excited to find this book called Living in Style, The New Art Deco, and the book is a fantastic book. It's all about how the Art Deco style has influenced many different hotels and public buildings around the world, and it's just a super book. It's just exactly what I wanted to do with my mystery blanket, was to use the Art Deco style, the flavour, the essence of everything that's to do with Art Deco, but to bring it into the modern age, into 2022, make it contemporary. So this book was a great source of inspiration, but I also used a lot of other visuals, postcards and greetings cards. The internet is a fabulous source for imagery, so I researched it on there and printed off lots of different patterns related to that style. I also love to think about words connected with my theme. An online thesaurus is perfect for this, so I popped in the words Art Deco and a few words that related to Art Deco and came up with a whole range of words which I found extremely inspiring when I was designing. Luxury, glamour, Chrysler, chrome, sleek, Cartier, chevrons, zigzags, platinum, Lanvin, sauvage, which names that you will recognise from some of the squares, suave, charisma, chandelier, opulent, jazz age, cool panache, Parisian glitz. Fantastic words, which I had these words with me the whole time I was designing, trying to make sure that when I was designing those squares, I was capturing all of these words in what I was designing. I also visited the V&A, where they have some really beautiful pieces of Art Deco homeware, some beautiful teapots and some glassware, vases. So I added all this inspiration to all the images to help me design the squares for the blanket. One of the first things that I do when I start designing is the colours are obviously are hugely important in a design. So the first thing I do is gather together my colour inspiration, and I took that from a couple of pages in this book that I've just been talking about, the Living in Style book. There are a couple of pages in there. I really love the visuals and the colours, and I combined these colours by looking at the current spring summer trends. There was a shades of coral were very important for this year, and sort of soft pinks and terracottas. So I brought those colours into the design, into the palette, combined with those beautiful sort of tealy and jade colours, all colours that I was seeing in my inspiration in the book, in the images, and trying to give it a very modern feel. So after selecting colours, I then moved on to my yarn selection, and I wanted to use yarns that were sort of high class yarns, that were elegant, luxurious. That's why I went for the Baby Cash Soft Merino, combining it with the beautifully soft, slightly hairy Kid Silk Haze and the Artiste Metallic, just giving it that extra kind of sparkle when I combined it with the Kid Silk Haze. So I used these beautiful yarns because they were soft and luxurious. They all contribute to this very kind of glamorous feel that I wanted to create in my design. And of course, there's plenty of beads in the design. It's heavily beaded. It's an extremely heavy blanket. Also, there's some rhinestones in there and buttons. So it's very embellished, which again was very important as part of the whole design to create this very sort of luxurious, sophisticated feel. I'm a bit old-fashioned with my designing. I like to get the sort of pen and paper out rather than putting everything onto a computer screen, which I find quite stifling when I'm designing. And one of the very first things I do is I create a colour layout for my design, where I look at colour placement and pattern placement, and this tends to be the sort of master plan that I go back to throughout the whole design process. Now, it does change, it evolves, it develops as the design goes on, and I change my mind about things that I may have decided at the beginning, and I change my mind halfway through the process. But it is kind of like my master plan, and this is kept beside me all the time as well as all the images and the words I spoke about, and I go back to it all the time to check that my colours are all in the right place, that it's all balanced, that it's harmonious, and that the pattern work and the colours are all working together. Next starts the sampling process. This is my most favourite part of the process, getting the knitting needles out, getting the yarns, all those gorgeous colours and yarns and beads, and starting to design. It's a lengthy process. I mean, it takes me a very long time, many months, to come up with the patterns for the blanket, and there's lots of toing and froing. Things don't always go right first time. In fact, it's more often than not, the development of a square goes through several different developments, with many samples being knitted. So I end up with a lot of squares or little bits of design that actually don't actually go into the blanket, but I keep them all because they're always good to go back to. If I'm stuck on a square and I'm thinking, I did something last week that I really liked, but I didn't go any further with. Sometimes I go back to an idea that I've shelved and I develop it on. And that's such an exciting part of the design process. So the sampling is obviously absolutely key. As I said, sometimes squares come out first time and I think, wow, this is exactly what I want. But other squares did take a lot of development. And next I'm going to talk to you about some of the squares in the blanket and just talk about the inspiration and how I designed them. So let's start with squares 1 and 2, Razzle Dazzle. I've got the blanket here, and you remember way back the very first 2 squares that we knitted were called Razzle Dazzle, and of course this was repeated for squares 6 and 7, 43 and 44 and 48 and 49, just in different colorways. So what was really a really important part of the design was this zigzag edging. Zigzag, the sort of geometric bold zigzags are very important in the Art Deco style, particularly towards the end of the Art Deco style. So I really thought that this would make a great edging for the blanket. And then you've got these Razzle Dazzle panels being inserted upside down so that along the top and bottom edges you have this lovely edging. There's beads there creating that glamorous kind of look. There's a rhinestone, there's also some of the metallic, artist metallic mix with the kid silk haze in there. So that one was a very glamorous square, all about the sort of the jazz age, the costumes of the Art Deco period, all very luxurious. And I love that chevron stitch. It's one of my favourite stitches, so useful in knitting designs. And it was great fun putting these colour combinations together for the Razzle Dazzle squares. They also are one panel. So this is something that I decided to do in the blanket, was not to just have single individual 49 squares, but to have panels, and the offsetting of those panels was something that was really important in the design. I didn't want every square just to be lined up exactly in order. I wanted that offset, which was achieved through having several 2 square panels in the blanket. The geometric influences from the Art Deco style can be seen sort of everywhere in the blanket. And another example of geometric patterning is in squares 3 and 47, 5 and 45. These are these squares called diamonds and zigzags. So 2 very sort of geometric patterns going on there, but in self-colour, in one colour. So in my design, I don't want every square to be full of colour. There have to be some breaks in between where you have solid squares, but I still want there to be interest in those squares. I chose in both of those squares to use sort of twisted stitches to give the textured zigzags, vertical zigzags this time, and the diamonds. And of course there's a splash of beads in there too. This was 2 squares that had very strict repeats, and I felt that those twisted stitches and slipping the stitches gave that very elegant, smooth look, which is very important to create this very kind of sophisticated look to the squares. And they were knitted in those gorgeous pale shades of vintage pink and mint. So that brings me to square 4, Cartier here, which is also repeated in square 46 and also in 22 and 23 and 27 and 28, or a variation of this square based on the jeweler Cartier. And I was looking at the necklaces and bracelets and those links and trying to translate them into a geometric repeat pattern. So that was the inspiration behind that one. Some Fair Isle for option 1, and for option 2 we had a stripe pattern but still using those same colours. And I the squares 22 and 23 are one of the sort of double panels there. So I took the Fair Isle design and extended it. I sort of modified it to fill these two squares, this space in the blanket, and added on buttons. These were optional. It was noted in the patterns about where you could use the buttons, because there's a lot used if you've done option 2, some of the option 2 squares. So yeah, the decorative kind of section here in the middle, which is repeated in other squares in the blanket, all sort of to do with jewellery, these kind of little loops of beads, looking at bracelets and necklaces of the Art Deco period. So in squares 9 and 10, flapper repeated in squares 40 and 41, and in 12 and 13 dapper, the Fair Isle patterns continue, some lovely sort of geometric patterns in 2 colour. These are both double panels again, they're 2 square panels, and they really focus. The flapper one is for the ladies and the dapper is for the men, so it's sort of focusing more on the elaborate costumes in the Art Deco period. So let's look at flapper first here in this beautiful teal and sort of soapy green colour. Again, it's got the sort of very decorative beaded section going through the centre there, but the Fair Isle pattern there is sort of based on very strong geometric patterns from prints from the Art Deco period. Little beads nestled in there just to give it a little bit of sparkle. And then that same kind of layout of that square is repeated in dapper, which swaps to those warm shades of chic and brick and nutkin, with that little bit of pickles, that gorgeous sort of goldy colour in the centre. And again, a repeat pattern, a very tight geometric repeat, just wonderful to design, and really I found very enjoyable to knit. I hope that you found it enjoyable to knit too. And again, nestled there, the gold beads that you can see there sparkling in the Fair Isle pattern. Those 2 squares, those 2 panels are similar to each other. They create, I feel, a good balance in the design. You've got similar panels but different colourways and slightly different Fair Isle patterns there. So it's one for the ladies and one for the men with the flapper and dapper squares. Now, I do love to design cable patterns. I find them really intriguing. After years of knitting cables and designing cables, the challenge for me is coming up with new cables, different ways to twist the stitches, different ways to knit them. So in the blanket this year, you have chic, panache and suave. They are your 3 cable squares, and all of them, to make them more defined and look a little bit more sophisticated and have cleaner lines, stitches are worked through the back of the loops at the edges of the cables, just to make them extra crisp and clean. And that was important for all those cables. They're all knitted in that same way, but with different twists, different numbers of stitches in the cables. They've all got some beading. Panache has rhinestones as well, and where you can see there's the rhinestone, the little beads underneath, that was kind of trying to interpret sort of jewellery. It is influenced by jewellery, having those lovely sort of tassels of glittering beads like jewels sparkling. I'm going to move on and talk about square 17, which is repeated in 3 other squares in the blanket, Sauvage. So this square was inspired by the work of Henri Sauvage, who was a French architect and designer. He started out in the Art Nouveau period, and then he moved across into Art Deco when he produced a amazing work in the 1920s and 30s. He designed many iconic buildings in Paris, including theatres and cinemas and luxury apartments. So this square, Sauvage, was based on sort of architecture. So those very strict diagonal lines using slip stitches with those little glittering beads, the idea of polished chrome, of steel, of structure in architecture. I wanted to keep it quite simple. I didn't want this to be complicated, but I just wanted there to be an essence of architecture in there. And that's why I used the baby silver colour, which is like a polished chrome. Very sleek and very sophisticated, and hopefully quite a nice one for you to knit. Squares 11 and 39 are inspired by the French designer René Lalique. He was a glassmaker and a jeweller, and like Henri Sauvage, his work had its roots in the Art Nouveau period, but then he moved into the Art Deco period, and he created and designed some absolutely beautiful glassware, chandeliers, vases, jewellery, loads of homeware. In fact, today the Lalique brand still continues to create these beautiful luxury items. I came across them in Selfridges in London, and they were so precious that you actually weren't allowed to go across the shop floor and touch them. You had to ask an assistant. In fact, I don't think you were even allowed to touch them if the assistant came across. So, the Lalique brand is hailed as the luxury living at its finest. And this is what these squares are all about. Knitted in the kid silk haze mixed with the Artiste metallic to give it that sort of sparkly look in a sort of delicate lace stitch in the bands of silver and gold. So I do love to design lace stitches, trying to come up with different combinations to create variations on all those lovely stitch patterns, lace stitch patterns that are out there, creating something new from something that has originated from stitch library patterns, but developed on to become something completely new and unique in this blanket. I want to talk to you next about squares 15 and 16 and 20 and 21, which are l'envers and l'envers 2. Now, these squares were inspired by the French haute couture designer Jean L'Envers, who designed some very exquisite, beautiful dresses in the 1920s and the 1930s. And you may also recognise the name from the perfume house, which she founded in 1924. So these squares are all about fine tailoring, precision work, beautiful fabrics. So I combined some lace stitches, which took lots of development to try and make them look like those very open kind of arched shapes that you see in some of the Art Deco geometric patterns. And also there's some stripes in there and just some delicate little scatterings of beads too. So they are similar, these two squares, but the l'envers 2 it's the lace pattern which changes. So it's a similar kind of shape, but a different stitch pattern. And of course there's a difference in colours too, with the original l'envers being in sort of the vintage pink and more warm colours in the palette, and l'envers 2 predominantly mint with the cooler colours from the palette. So a real mixture of different techniques in that square, in these two square panels, which are repeated twice more in the blanket. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about square 25 then, the centre square Deco Dreams. Now, when I've talked to some of the members about the blanket and how it's all coming together, often it's been said to me that, you know, it's the centre square that pulls it all together. So until that centre square drops into place, sometimes it's hard to see how it's all going to pull together and work as a design. But Deco Dreams in the centre of the blanket pulls in its inspiration from all the other squares really in the blanket. So it's got the gold metallic thread, it's got the geometric beaded pattern that you see in Razzle Dazzle, it's got the little decorative stripe, I think in 2 or 3 colours, which you have also seen before in squares like Flapper and Dapper. So it's sort of a bringing together of all these techniques and colours in a really super sparkly square, just to pull everything together. So that's all the squares in the blanket that I'm going to talk about. I hope you found it interesting to hear how they've developed and where the inspiration came for them. The last thing, of course, is the edging. So it's a top and bottom edges continue on the chevron pattern with increases and decreases. So it might look incredibly complicated, but just follow it row by row. All the instructions are there, hopefully quite clearly laid out, and you get this very sort of effective edging, where when you are increasing and decreasing along those edges of those chevrons, you get that lovely kind of zigzag effect along the edges of those squares. That happens along the top and the bottom edges, and then the side edges are that same garter stitch stripe pattern, but let's have a look here, but along the straight edge there, so there's no increasing, decreasing, apart from the miters at the corners to shape the edges of all 4 edgings. Okay, so that's the blanket, that's the story behind it. I really hope that you've enjoyed learning all about the squares that you've been knitting this year and finding out all the inspiration behind them, and how they were created. In the rest of the blog, there is lots of advice about this month's squares, plus some other interesting bits and pieces to read. So please make sure that you give it a read before you start on your squares. There's lots of things about the edging and about the finishing to really help you through to the end of this project. You may have read in previous blogs about the members gallery, which I'm going to put live on our website in the new year. I like to do this at the very the end of the year, beginning of the next year, before we begin the next blanket, and I'm inviting all of you to send in any pictures you've got of Debbie projects. Obviously pictures of your blanket and of your mystery cushion too, if you've worked on that this year, would be brilliant, but anything else Debbie related would be lovely to see, and then it will be shared on my website with everybody that comes to have a look at all the wonderful work that's been done this year. So that leaves me to say thank you to everybody for taking part in this year's Mystery Blanket Club and for being fabulous members. It's been an absolute joy to knit along with you all, to hear all your comments, to share this knitting adventure with you this year. And if you've signed up for 2023, it's not over, because we'll get back on it in February and start all over again on a brand new adventure. So I hope to see you then in 2023. Until then, please take care. Have a fabulous Christmas. It's time to get the tree soon. I'll be getting it at the end of this week. So have a fabulous Christmas. Keep those needles clicking away, and I'll see you in 2023. Goodbye, everybody.